My name is Reese Williams. I am the Community Engagement Manager for Manchester City of Literature, and I'm really excited to be a part of this first element of a project that we're putting together in partnership with Commonword called The Hook. And it's all about celebrating the work of Diké Omeje, who had a significant impact and has a significant impact on the literature scene in Manchester. Unfortunately, he passed away some time ago, but his work is still finding new ways to resonate with people. And this whole project is really about that. It's about us being inspired by the work of writers who have gone before us, of finding new meaning in their work, and to be inspired as listeners, as readers, and as writers. Off the back of this conversation, we're going to be setting members of the public some creative challenges. So if you're a writer at home, watch the video, listen to the conversation, listen to all the wonderful poetry that you're going to hear, and you'll have an opportunity to submit some of your own poetry to Manchester City of Literature, and we'll document that in a way that is poignant, in a way that is meaningful. And as I said at the start of this introduction, we'll find ways, hopefully, to continue to keep the fire of Diké's work alive, even in his absence in body. Okay, I'm going to keep it moving. I've been speaking already for about 30 seconds, and I'm going to introduce some of the people who are in this conversation with me. And I'm going to go in no particular order. I will start with Segun. So we have Segun Lee French. Segun has worked as a singer, poet, composer, playwright, filmmaker, and club promoter. As a singer for cult band Earthling, he featured on 2 critically acclaimed albums on Cool Tempo and toured across Europe performing on MTV, BBC One, VH1, Canal 5. As a poet and playwright, Segun's work has been commissioned for broadcast on BBC Radio 3 and Radio Manchester. Segun's debut solo show, Bro 9 at Contact Theatre, won the Best Fringe Performer and Best Design in the Manchester Evening News Theatre Award in 2003. He is a nominee for the Arts Foundation Performance Poetry Award, and his first poetry collection, Praise Songs for Aliens, was published in 2009. His most recent play, Palm Wine and Stout, was featured on Radio 4 midweek and toured the UK in 2014. He is currently writing Jimmy Jimmy, a musical psychodrama about the legendary jazz singer Jimmy Scott, and recording an EP of deconstructed 80s pop songs. Quite a bio there, Segun. Quite a bio. Excellent. Great to have you with us, Segun. Again, good
to be here.
In no particular order, I'm going to move on to Cheryl Martin. Cheryl is a 2-time Manchester Evening News Theatre Award winner as a writer and as a director. She was guest curator for Liverpool's Homotopia 2018, the UK's largest LGBTQ+ festival. She is a co-artistic director of the Manchester's Black Gold Arts Festival. Cheryl's acclaimed Homotopia commissioned show, Rent Party, is still touring nationally after 2 years on the road. Her new solo show, which is a one-woman piece and is R&D supported by Made at Home, won an Unlimited Welcome Collection Partnership Award, Main Commission, and is headed for the South Bank Centre in 2021. Her 2018 play on HIV for Contact, I Am Because We Are, is headed for a national and international 2020 tour. I think that might change in light of the circumstances we're in at the minute, but it's big news. Cheryl's first solo stage show, Alaska, featured twice at Contact's Flying Solo Festival before a national tour, including 2016's A National Theatre, and still touring, and featured in the 2019 Summer Hall Edinburgh Fringe. It was inspired by her Polari Prize long-listed first collection of poems, also called Alaska, published by Commonwealth's Crocus Books. And I'll take a breath again. Another really, really meaty and really poignant bio. I don't actually have bios for the remaining 2 panelists, but I can speak well of them, I believe. I know them both rather well. So I will start with Shirley May. Shirley May's first collection of poetry came out just over a year and a half ago now, 18 months ago, and it's called She Wrote Her Own Eulogy, and it was published by Wrecking Ball Press. It is an absolutely fantastic collection. Shirley has been a part of the Speakeasy Poetry Collective for over 20 years, and she is the founder and artistic director of the Young Identity Writing Charity based here in Manchester. And she's likewise has performed nationally, internationally, all over the place with her work. Finally, we have Mike Garry. Again, I couldn't tell you about Mike Garry's accolades too much, but I can tell you that Mike does have a nationwide TV advert, which is my favourite one of the lot. So yeah, I'm going to make you a little bit embarrassed there. But I'd also say as well with Mike, again, his work speaks for himself. He's been commissioned by various high-profile organizations. And yeah, he's an exceptional writer in his own right, and somebody who early in my writing career, I really looked up to, and he really supported me as I was starting out as a writer. I've not forgotten, last but not least, I was deliberate with this bit because it leads nicely into the first item for discussion. We have Pete Kalu. He's a short story writer, a novelist, storyteller, playwright, and poet. His short stories range in style from the realist to the surreal to the carnivalesque, and can be found in various anthologies, including Closure, which is published by People Tree Press in 2015, A Country to Call Home, which is published by Unbound 2017, and Seaside Special, which was published by Blue Moose in 2018. His poetry has been widely published, performed, and displayed within the UK. So there we go. We have a fantastic panel. Yeah, we can give some figure clicks there. We've got a fantastic panel. And I think what unites each and every single person here, which is really important, and as a reason why they're here for this panel, is they all knew Diké personally. They were all friends. They all broke bread with him. They all wrote with him, and they all were on the circuit with Diké. So I guess there's nobody else better to speak about the work and the life of Diké than these people on this conversation. So we really are delighted at Manchester City of Literature to have these wonderful panelists with us. Okay, so I'm going to get it going. I'm going to hand over to Pete Kalu for a minute, and he's going to speak briefly about Diké's work, about his collections. And Mike Garry, again, Mike knows his work really well. He published Diké's second collection. So please do chip in as you feel appropriate, Mike. Over to you, Pete.
Okay. Thanks very much for that introduction, Rhys. And it's great to have Mike Garry alongside us. I must say that Mike Garry beat me to the publication finish line with Diké, in that Mike Garry actually published him first with The Minefield, and I'm sure Mike's going to talk a little bit more about that process and the contents of that. What happened with this collection, which Commonword published, which is called Grafting the Practice, and we have copies available if you need them, is that the collection came about as a result of him winning the Northwest Poetry Slam. I remember his fabulous performance at Night and Day, where he got the audience's verdict. I think the judge's verdict might have been gone to Pauline Omoboye, but Diké was riding high. He wore that crown. If you find the photographs, he's got the crown. He anointed as king of poetry in Manchester at that time. And the winner got to have a publication by Commonword. So I thought we'd be doing the usual, his greatest hits kind of thing. But Diké's a smart guy. He read the fine print of the competition rules, and he said, Pete, it doesn't say I have to publish my greatest hits. It says I can choose whatever I want to go into my collection. And as a result, he said, what I want to publish actually is something that is not necessarily of great popular appeal, but which is very, very deeply personal to me and important to me. And that is exactly the title of it, Crafting the Practice, how I go about being a poet and writing my poetry. And so while it startled me at first that, we weren't going to be able to, let's face it, might compete with the Minefield, Mike could call up all the greatest hits. It was a revelation for me because I learned a lot about his processes. And the poems that we'll be hearing today, I think will reflect some of the varied ways in which he goes about writing. My one contribution, my one highfalutin contribution maybe to an understanding of Diké is that I consider him to be a metaphysical poet, in the sense that he wasn't particularly engaged with confessional poetry about the intimacies and the day-to-day detail of his life. He was more concerned with a much wider landscape of what we are as human beings walking around on this earth in this time, in this moment, in a sort of generalized way. And he liked to bring in issues to do with philosophy, psychology, and pick up metaphor and extend that metaphor throughout a poem without necessarily detailing his work with that personal touch. And so for that reason, I think of him as a metaphysical poet. And the last thing I'd make before handing over to Mike, the last point I'd make is that within the metaphysics of his poetry, there is sometimes a focus on using your time as best as you can and having an understanding that we're not on this earth long. So let's do the best we can with the time that we've got. And I'm sure Shirley will remember the shock when we learned that actually he'd been living effectively under a death sentence for 10 years because he knew he had lymphoma or whatever it was, you know, and he knew that his days were marked, that the doctors had not given him long to live. And so he really did live his life and live his poetry life as if, in the words of one of the poems, you know, this may be my last poem. This may be my last day. And that sense of urgency is seen through all his writing. That's me.
Oh yeah, can you all hear me all right?
Thank
Brilliant.
you.
Great piece, Pete. I'm going to just jump on a straight thing. I think it's really, really important that we start this whole conversation with that fact that Diké was living with a life sentence. From whenever we all knew him, all right, my mum knew him at primary school. She taught him at primary school. But before, for the whole of our lives, we knew Diké. He was living with a sword swinging over his head. And that comes through his poetry lots. And that's the reason for his metaphysics in lots of ways, because Diké spoke beyond the here, the now, the planets. He spoke of the ether and beyond and stuff. So I massively agree with that. And the minefield. So my relationship with Diké was mates, but I was incredibly inventive and I was making poetry books like all you guys from the age of 5 years old, stapling them together, writing things, drawing pictures on them. And it was just a natural process as a librarian for me to continue to do that. And I've done a few myself, and Diké was the next person to do it. And because Diké we understood each other so much and how we both operated because we spent so much time together. And there was a massive trust there that we could do it however he wanted. So it was literally him sitting with my designer Anthony Ball and just slowly knocking out these poems. I always said I'm never going to interfere. I hate the layout of Diké's poetry. I hate the stupid numbers and letters. I hate some of the sexual drawings and the horrible. Not me or my style at all. But he was allowed a chalkboard to do with whatever he wanted, and I think that's important that I allow people to do that. You know what I mean? Yeah. But at the same time, it is all altered when we read it, knowing the facts. When we realise what lay behind it. He was the healthiest, fittest man I ever met, man. He was in the gym more than anything else. He was fit as a butcher's dog. I didn't know a woman who didn't love him. Not sure whether that was aesthetic or voice, though. But the making of the minefield was a journey for both of us, but it just brought us closer and closer. And it was great because during the making of the minefield as well, we had lots of daft little things going on which we were attempting to do, like going to Arvon together, like putting on poetry nights together with a £10 budget, writing together, setting ourselves little writing tasks and things like that. So we wrote together. When the minefield eventually came out, he was incredibly proud of it, as I was. And I think it was important for him to get it out. I worked on him with a couple of other things. One was a CD that I've got. I've got a full CD collection of Diké with music. But there's another one as well. There's the very last thing he did, which is a recording with a guy who I knew years ago. But this guy's disappeared off the face of the planet. But I've heard one track from it, and I think I sent it to Pete and Shirley once, and it was staggering. It was staggering. It was like his last thing, saying, listen, this is the last thing I'm going to do here, and it was just breathtaking.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's
I remember he did I'm Tired. I don't know if anyone caught that performance at the Green Room, and that blew me away. I think that was one of his best poems ever. Certainly as a moment in time, that time on the stage when he did that. We've got a tape of it somewhere. I'm not sure if that's part of the tape of the guy you're talking about, but yeah, there's some phenomenal work. So
I was going to say that I think that was filmed at Contact, and he talks about, even in many ways, almost like a prophet. He talks about how, he's tired of footballers being paid more than the real people, like the nurses and the doctors. And right at this current moment, it's almost like a prophetic statement that he's tired of this and he's tired of that. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I just thought that, yeah, I really kind of see some of what he was writing back then, almost in this pandemic time now. And I would say that I agree with Peter in terms of it being a metaphysical book, but I do believe that Crafting the Practice, if you watch it and you read it, he is actually talking about him dying. Each page has some element of his death. So I, in many ways, feel that it is very personal. And I just think that it was coded so that people wouldn't see that actually he was, he was having this battle and this struggle. But Crafting the Practice of even O'Minefield is definitely talking about his death.
And there were layers to Diké, and of course, like you say, some of those the layers were hidden, and we came to notice them perhaps after he'd passed. One of the layers that everyone knew was his vocal dexterity, his brilliance on the stage, and his brilliance with his voice. I remember him singing at Green Room. I think he did one of the old blues songs once. But he had a great vocal control, and even as he was ailing, he actually adapted it. I don't know if you remember, Shirley, when he did that show at Central Library, when his lungs were going and he could hardly breathe in and out. And he adapted the poem so that it became part of the performance of the poem. It's a kind of preamble to queuing up Cheryl to read his work. I'm trying to say, we'll lower the bar, We know none of us can be Diké, but we're going to do our best, I'm sure.
I guess that's into me, because I'm reading one from Penultimate. And the reason I chose, I'm reading one from Crafting the Practice called Penultimate. And the reason why I chose this one is because it was so clearly foreshadowing the fact that he was going to die. And then it's also talking about, you were talking, Shirley, about the pandemic time that we find ourselves in now. And it seems as if every word is really about now, because that whole thing, it's always been true that when you walk out your door, you don't know if you're going to walk back in. I mean, you could get hit by a bus, anything can happen. But this period right now has brought that to the fore for people really thinking about it. And I'll just read the poem because it sort of speaks for itself. Penultimate. This may be the last time that I try to shine on darkened shores. This may be my last find in the gold mines that define the cause. This may be the last time that my feet ever touch these floors. This may be my last rhyme in the shallow end of metaphors. This might be my last try to right the wrongs with verbal tools. This might be my last pitch in the game that makes, then breaks its rules. This may be my last flight through the skies of individuality, or the bite that rips the fingers off the hand that thinks it's feeding me. This may be my last shot in the darkness of hypocrisy, the last watch that I keep before I give up waiting patiently, the last knot I try to tie to hold the weak seams of democracy, the last time that I lie before I turn to face you, honestly. Truth is, what is what's meant to be. What you get is what you see. What you miss is what is left of me, devoid of poetry. But what is left is what you always see. So what you see is what you get. What is left without the poetry is the me I've never met. This may be the last line of defense to save my dignity. This may be my last try to harness and hold an audience for poetry. This may be the first or the last time that you notice me. Maybe the last time that I climb onto the fence and sit indifferently. This may be my last gift to a God that always wants for more. This may be my last prayer, the first time I've really prayed before. This may be my last breath, or the breath that I've been waiting for. This may be my first death, or the first time that I've killed before. This may be my last rave before I leave behind a tortured youth. This may be my last shave before I grow into an old recluse. This may be the last time I clench my fist around a pen. This may be the last time that I write before I write again. And,
Wow.
you know,
Wow.
I know it's just,
Getting goosebumps listening to that. Wow.
It does, it's just, you know, Diké was, you know, such, like you said, he was a gorgeous person. He was good looking. He was so talented. It was like he was a magician when he was on stage, the way that he, you know, hypnotized an audience. And he never failed to do that. And listening to the poem, it just brings back, sometimes when you're in the audience, you're just listening, you just get carried away with the sense and the flow and, you know, how wonderful all that feels in the moment. But when you're reading it, and now, like you said, Pete, reading it after the fact, and like you said, Shirley, just realizing he was talking to us about what was happening to him, but we didn't even know it. And I was one of the ones who was shocked out of my mind when Diké died. I had no idea. And reading that poem, it's a wonderful poem. And like I said, it's so much, because it's so much about what was real to him. And he was so good at talking about himself and what he felt so honestly. That's why it's still, you know, it's just about now, but it'll always be about now, because those things are always true. So I'll be quiet now.
I would have to say that I agree wholeheartedly with you, that, you know, the piece is so much about now and so much about then. Beautiful.
Segun, I saw you had your hand up as well. You wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I think this particular piece, I think, was, I actually think crafting the practice as a whole was quite influential on quite a few Mancunian poets who were young at the time. And I think one of the things about Penultimate, I think, and one of the things about Diké, I think, which I loved, but drove me crazy at times as well, was that he had his style and he would do it in exactly his style. And if you look at the way that he phrases Penultimate, it's very similar to some of his earliest poems. That the rhythmical style that he does, the rhyming patterns that he does, and also the patterns of meaning, the way he does couplets, which I actually think is something that he derives a lot from rap music, because a lot of, if you listen to a lot of rap music, they'll do meaning in couplets that adds up to an overall meaning for the whole verse. But actually, if you're looking for it to actually be a continuous stream of meaning, it doesn't do it like that. You deal in little chunks at a time that gather meaning. So I think Penultimate is really quite typical of that. And I think it's Yeah, it's as Shirley said, as Cheryl said, it's when you're listening to him, because his diction was so crisp, and because his pacing was so measured. I think one of the things that probably you can only get is by watching videos of Diké is the fact that he read his poems really slowly, but you've got such a wealth of I don't know what sort of word for it is. You've got such a wealth of meaning on top of the words, which I still can't define what the meaning was that he was carrying over. It was his persona, essentially, that he was carrying over, but there was a power behind it that meant that often, actually, you wouldn't be aware of what the actual individual lines were saying, because you're being so carried by the intensity with which he was performing it. And I think that's you're quite right there, Cheryl, that he would hypnotize audiences. The audiences would be captured, and they would be completely silent, apart from occasionally just going blah, 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 woo, and screaming occasionally. But generally speaking, they'd be silent until the end, when suddenly they'd erupt in applause. I have to say, I've probably only once seen another poet who performs with such mastery of the craft, and that was.
Thanks, Segun. That's really nice of you, mate.
You're fantastic, Mike. But actually, it was Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka is the only other poet I know who's just had such ability to capture an audience and to carry them along without them actually not actually thinking about what he's saying. Sometimes it's amazing.
Thank you for that, Segun. I'm going to go over to Pete. Pete's got his hand up, and I think Shirley might have had her hand up. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shirley. But yeah, we'll go with Pete first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just briefly, as a poet's journey, the journey that Diké was on did actually involve an evolution of his poetry. And one of the things that Segun's talking about with the regularity of the meter of his lines occurs in many of his early poems, and actually most of his, if I may say that, famous poems have a certain beat that I could recognize as the Diké beat. And what my work with him was sometimes was to throw him off it, to make him develop a more complex beat. And one of the things that we did was we sent him to perform with Jean Binta Breeze. And he went up there with Jean Binta Breeze. And if anyone knows Jean Binta Breeze, the woman's absolutely astonishing. And he came out of it and said, "Pete, I've got a lot to learn still." And that was wonderful to see him then start cooking again and breaking his form down and building it back up in a much more complex way. And that was one of the joys. So yeah, he certainly never stayed still as a poet. He was always ready to learn. And there was a humility to the way in which he went about that craft. If you could bring something to him, he'd absorb it.
Thanks for that, Pete. I'm going to go to Shirley and then quickly to Cheryl, and then we're going to keep the conversation moving with the next reading.
I would say that, again, I agree with Peter. It was always a challenge for me to say to him, would you not change the rhythm of the pieces? And we worked a lot together. We would go to open mics together. And one of the things that he tried to do to change the rhythm of his piece was he came up with the totem poem, which is one word on every line, which he then tried to do in a kind of very staccatoed way. So I think in Mike's book, and also Crafting the Practice, in Cheers Tar's book, Minefield, he has a few of the totem poems in the book, and also in Crafting the Practice, where each word became, so it was really quite staccato in the way that it was delivering. So he was experimenting in changing the way that he was delivering the work as well. But he always used to say also is that he didn't really need to change that much, because every audience was a different audience. And so he was going to all of these different places around the country, winning competitions and slams and stuff like that. And he was like, well, they've never heard me before, so I don't know about the way that I deliver, which I thought was arrogant in its approach, but equally Diké to the T. Do you know what I mean?
Excellent. Cheryl?
well, what I was going to say actually was about the rhythm, you know, that sort of trademark Diké rhythm. I think there was a reason why he was king of the slams. If you think about oral poetry, people forget that Homer was oral poetry. And it also has a very definite rhythm that carries it through. And that is to help the audience, you know, the reason why he was able to hypnotize is partially because of the way that rhythm draws you in. And then, I mean, it's impossible to describe, you know, like the personal charisma and stage presence that he had, but that rhythm, you know, Homer does it, you know, other oral, you know, traditions do that. And it's about, that is how you carry people with you. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for that, Cheryl. And thank you for everyone there. Again, really interesting stuff. And I think the last point I'll chip in on this with that particular piece, Shirley will know from Young Identity, that's my favorite Diké poem that you just read. And I think for me, why it's beautiful is a little bit of what Segun was saying in terms of hip hop. And so much of hip hop is set up on punchline. And as Pete was saying, it's also a very simple structure, which is this may be the last time that I do this before that happens, but that's what makes it equally powerful. And I think for me, a question I asked myself reading it, having never met Diké in person, but been inspired by his work for a long time, I found myself asking, was some of these things that he said, this could be the last time that this thing happens? Was he writing out his fears? And by the end, when he says, before I write again, that's his final act of defiance, is that, you know, through my pen, you know, to quote Shakespeare, through my pen, I will live forever. You know, I will ever live young. So I think there's something really meaningful and really moving in that element of it. But again, I'm just speculating here. I'm going to keep it moving, and I'm going to move over to Segun, and Segun's going to read a selected poem of Diké's. Thanks.
Okay, I've chosen the Body Snatchers. It's one of them. I think it's one of the first poems that I heard Diké do. I think the first one was actually Party in the Penthouse, which was I'd say probably the quintessential metaphysical poem of Diké. But this one is I think what I liked about the Body Snatchers was that it started off with you. It starts off with you not knowing where he's going, and it also, I think it was probably the first time I'd heard a poet really refer to science fiction in their poetry. It was before I'd read various African American poets who did it in the 60s and 70s. But the way that he weaves it in is really quite beautiful. Anyway, here we go. The Body Snatchers. They are in disguise when all the while you thought you knew them. They appear in human guise, but if you look real close, you can see right through them. They penetrate your mind. That's how they know so much about you. There they mature like vintage wine, fermenting negatives to doubt you. It's always a surprise, and it always hurts when they betray you. Their colors are inside and only show when they've enslaved you. But now I'm almost one of them, and it's so damn hard to fight this. Almost one of them, so I just have time to write this. To whom it may concern, if you should ever find this notice, from these words, I hope you'll learn I was like you before I wrote this. Don't look to the skies, because they won't come from up above you. But you will know when they arrive, because they always say, I love you.
Wow. Yeah, we could definitely give some clicks and some signals for that. Wow.
It's a heavy poem.
Where to start, Segun? Where to start with this piece?
I guess one thing I'd say is that he did, as you pointed out, he loved the punchline. And this one, I think, along with when he did Superman, was which someone else can talk about. This was just one where people would be sitting there going, yeah, that's an interesting image. Oh, yeah, it's an interesting image. And then they'd suddenly cotton on when it came to actually the penultimate line, because they'd see the rhyme that he was heading to. And it was obvious what the rhyme was when he got to the penultimate line, but it was not obvious what he was talking about for the entire poem. That's what I loved about it. They just suddenly go, oh yeah. Relationships. And many times, I mean, I probably saw him do it, I don't know, 10, 15 times, that poem. Every time he did it, later on, at the beginning, they didn't used to say the line, but I think later on, they would say the line without him prompting them. He would just stop and they would just go, I love you, boom. Yeah, that's the semantic force that he has in that poem. He carries you through all these images to this point where there's no other conclusion that you can come to.
It was a bit like Chris Martin singing Fix You with Coldplay Alive, where the crowd join in at the end.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
He was a rock star poet.
Yeah. Pete, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I think this poem, The Body Snatchers, is very much shows his skills as a storyteller. You know, he takes you on this journey, on the story, on the suspense, as Segun's saying, is that you don't quite know where you're going, but he's got all these lovely undulations and slight variations and going away from this path, but you know there's a point, there's an end point, and it's like, come on, where are we going? Where are we going? And the guesswork is, okay, I think we're going here. Maybe we're going there. No, wait a minute, he's going somewhere else, you know. And you're guessing, and you never quite guess where he ends up taking you. And the lovely thing, the thing that I love, and for once, I actually think this works beautifully on the page. And maybe he would do it with his voice a little bit, but I never heard him do it as well as perhaps it occurs on the page, is that within the story, you get a letter. You get a little epistle, if we make it sound a little more grand, you know? He writes this beautiful letter. So if I disappear, this is what killed me. You know, like these hostages or people who put a letter in a bottle and send it off. You know, it's such a fabulous conceit, a fabulous idea within the poem. And so, yeah, just hearing Segun and seeing it on the page again, I just, you know, I admire that. I admire the ingenuity of it.
Thank you for that, Mike. Pete, Mike, you're going to make a point, and then we'll come back to Segun.
Yeah, epistle. Yeah, I always got a lot of biblical stuff from Diké. He was very close to a God. It was important to him. There was a lot of biblical reference throughout his work, and the way he delivered it was almost, I don't know if it's a religious way or the way he spoke was with a form of authority, and you have spoke about his delivery style and stuff, and I do think part of that is, I'll keep coming back to this because I'm morbid, but I do think you've seen something when you know you're going to die. I do think your mind is beyond what our mortal lives are. When you know the inevitability of death is round the corner, I do believe we grow another sense. And something to take into account with what Pete was saying there about the style of his narrative and stuff like that. Don't forget what was Diké when he died, 35. So what was he writing this 25 when he was about 25? It was only 15 years beforehand, 16 years beforehand. He was listening to parables and stories in school and things like that. And they were very adaptations. His biggest message to us about his death was the 3 little pigs. Do you know what I mean? It comes from the from the heart of a child. A lot of Diké's work in lots of ways. That's me done.
Yeah. Well, he talks about blowing your house down, doesn't he, in the 3 little pigs, and the house is a metaphor for his life. You know, and I would say that in all the conversations, because Diké and I was really extremely close in a way that, I realised after he died that I was probably in love with him slightly, like the rest of the planet, because he was pretty and he was good looking. So, yeah, I think that in terms of just his persona and just what he was trying to get across, there was that message of his life, but also it was mixed in with, actually, he knew he was dying. He knew he was dying from he was 17 years of age. And in, I think it was 17 or 18, where he found the first growth, because he died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he has the growth removed and doesn't tell his parent. He goes to the hospital, has the growth removed, doesn't tell anybody, and then goes back to work. And the doctors were saying, you need to have chemotherapy when you have a growth like that removed. And he was like, no chemotherapy, you know. And so I think that there was a vanity in him about the way that he looked, and he knew that chemotherapy may change that. But also, he wanted to be in control of what went in and out of his body. Like you said, Mike, earlier, he was the fittest guy, you know, the fittest person that I knew, but yet he was carrying this thing, and he was carrying it from he was a teenager, and pretty much by himself, you know, because that's the sort of person that he was. Sorry, have I just gone on? I went off on a tangent a little bit, so sorry.
No, it's okay. It was springboarded by what was being said by Mike in terms of, you know, the blowing down the house, the Three Little Pigs, etc. But Segun, you had a point. We'll finish on Segun's point, and then we're going to come back to Shirley, who's going to read her selected poem of Diké's.
Yeah. As Shirley said, I mean, I had a thing with Diké, because I knew how much he was inspired by rap. And so I used to tease him by calling him the ladies' love poet, and it used to really annoy him. That's why I said it, because he was so much more than the love god on stage. You know what I mean? But one of the things I think that Pete was pointing out, and I think that Mike was pointing out as well, about the what's the word? The epistle style. I think essentially he was actually quite theatrical, I guess, and I started to realise there was one point where I realised some of his inspiration. It was when he told me that his favourite film was one of his favourite films, two of his favourite films. One was The Gladiator, and the other one was The Princess Bride. And when I watched, and I didn't see The Princess Bride until last year, and when I watched it, I was like, "Oh my God, that's Diké!" Because the smart Alec comments and some of the where they twist meaning and it was just like sometimes it was just like listening to Diké. So there's a certain amount of drama that he wanted to pull out in his poetry, in the way that he puts various different quotes and these letters in there, and I think it makes it exciting to read and it makes it exciting to listen to, definitely.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Segun. We're going to go over to Shirley now, and Shirley's going to read her selected Diké poem.
So the piece that I'm going to read is called Enacted, and in the book The Minefield, he actually says about the author. So Enacted. Blessed are those who believe me. Cursed are those who do not. Tested are those who refuse to believe that this life is not all that they've got. Rejected are those who deceive me. Retested are those who repent. Respected are those who choose not to believe what I said, but knew what I meant. Detested are those who enslaved me. Infected are those who agree. Disconnected are those who impose on my nature and question my right to be me. Inspected are those who befriend me. Selected are those who are true. Detected are those dressed in clothes to disguise their dishonesty and try to get through. Resurrected are the foes who prove worthy. For what good is this life without trial? But never ending be the power that serves me. For in the face of my enemy, I smile. So of all of Diké's pieces, thank you, of all of Diké's pieces, this was probably the one that actually ended up connecting us as friends and lifelong friends until he passed away. I was probably one of the only people that he told that he had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I remember when he told me, and I remember when he swore me to absolute secrecy. Well, for somebody like me who liked to chat, it was the hardest thing to be given that piece of information. Yeah, right, innit, Mike? And it's the hardest piece of information to have, to hold, and to shield him from what he didn't want was a load of people saying, oh, this is why I did this, or this is why I did that. And when you look at Enacted, he really is telling you about who he is in there, how he tested people, how he didn't trust people, how he would, in fact, at times, test them and to see what their dishonesty was or wasn't, and whether or not they'd done anything that was worthy of forgiveness, where he might take down his guard a little, and so it's one of my favourite pieces, along with The Messenger. Now, Diké always told me that he was actually an atheist, and what was extremely we would spend hours talking about God, and because at the time I was, saved, sanctified, born, and all the rest of it. Not much like that now, but that's what poetry does, takes away your twin set and pearls. And yeah, so going back to the poem, infected are those who agree, disconnected are those who impose on my nature, and want to change me, so there's so much in the piece that is absolutely saying, if you read this, you know me, and if you know me, read this, because actually this is about me.
Thanks for that, Shirley. And I think coming back to, I guess, what you've just said, Shirley, what Segun said earlier, what Pete said earlier, what everyone said so far, again, there's something very spiritual. The Beatitudes comes to mind here. This is basically Diké's version of the Beatitudes. So the Beatitudes, which is, Jesus giving his Sermon on the Mount, and he's talking about these principles to live life by, and, encouraging, like Pete was saying before, Diké had this ability to write about the bigger conditions beyond just himself. And what's really powerful is, even though this is a really personal piece, it's a human truth, isn't it? Here's how I deal with people who disrespect me. Here's how I actually interact with people who have proved a worthy foe. Here's how I interact with people that have been deceitful to get close to me. And that's this something really beautiful in that, in being inspired by the Beatitudes in that way, and writing in such a modern, beautiful style, basically.
Well, I feel like the last 4 lines, for what good is this life without trial, but never ending be the power that serves me. So in the face of my enemy, smile. It is such a mantra for me. The whole poem is my mantra on how I live my day, because life can be so hard, but you've got to learn to navigate it, and navigate those people who cause you problems and cause you an issue. And I think that he leaves you with the final line, again, that final line, a bit like what Segun was saying about, that the final line is going to be that line, about love. And so in the face of my enemy, I smile. So you don't know quite what's going on. You don't know who he is or what mysteries that he has going on, because actually he's going like this. He's smiling. He's not really wholly telling you. Yeah,
Pete. And then
I think Cheryl put her hand up first, so I don't know what the Zoom protocol is for that. But I'd better hand over to Cheryl first.
That's really kind of you, Pete. I wanted to say something about both what the poem that Shirley just read and what Segun was talking about, Diké being influenced by rap. And the fact that rap actually is influenced again by the Black church in the States, because there's only like a sliver between the street corner rapper and the street corner preacher or the storefront preacher, and that way of talking again that takes your audience in and takes them on that journey. And so, when you go into the Beatitudes and blessed are they, and and what's funny is that when he starts off with the blessed are they, and then that next line is cursed are they, and I'm like, well, this is not quite Jesus, is it? So it's like, it's just a little bit harder,
Old Testament,
a bit more in your face.
Testament.
Yeah, a little Old Testament stuff going on. So yeah, but I feel like that is there in Diké's rhythm, in the way that he talks. And so now, Pete, I will give back over to you.
Yeah, I thought I would like to just make a few comments on the the techniques he's used in this. First of all, picking up what many have said about the religiosity, if you like, the blessed. What a major opening. It's kind of a classic line from the Bible, and then the twist in it. We've had a double twist today, because we've had the twist that Cheryl points out, which is cursed, comes straight away. But we've had the twist from Shirley, which is, I'm an atheist, So, these contradictions are within the man himself as well as within the poems. But I did feel that was the order of his understanding of the world. Blessing comes before curse. He gives it, his default was to believe in things and to believe in people, not in a religious way, but to have faith in people. And many of the people who I met and spoke with after he died said to me that Diké got me. Of all the people I knew, it was Diké who actually saw me. And maybe what Mike was saying about how if you may be dying tomorrow or whatever, you see through a lot of the superficial in life. So that was something that he starts with blessed, and then in the ending, just in terms of the rhyming scheme, it's a weird thing that it's, I don't know what kind of image or metaphor, but usually the rhyme tends to head to the end. But in this, the lines of this poem are the weight is at the beginning, blessed, cursed, disconnected. It's the beginning of the lines that hit until the end when he actually shifts, and he shifts almost without you noticing. He shifts that weight to the end of the line carefully, so that, as Shirley pointed out, by the end line, in the face of my enemy, see where the stress is going now? I smile. So he started with blessed, cursed at the beginnings of the lines, and by the end of the poem, he shifted all the way to the other end. And it's that craft, that's the craft that Diké had, that is part of his appeal, which is so smoothly done, we don't notice it, especially in performance. We have to sit down and kind of study him sometimes.
Thank you for that, Pete. Yeah, really insightful. Really good points in terms of the form and the technicalities of it. And I guess for me, it really speaks to that element of taking a skill that you have on the stage and making that relevant even as a writer in how you pin your words down on the page. I think that's really powerful. Okay, we're going to keep it moving, and we're going to move on to Mike Garry. And Mike, again, was a very, very close friend of Diké's, and he's going to read his selected Diké.
Yeah, I'm going to read Morning Dews. And like it's been said all the way through, I'm never going to get anywhere near how the man did it himself, but I'll do the best. Bit of background. This was wrote just after 9/11, and we give each other writing tasks, and this was a writing task. So we set each other. I went on to write something else. But imagine somebody stood in 9/11 in the Twin Towers as it sets aflame. This is called Morning Dews. We ruin our own lives through our own lack of intervention. Twist all our own knives right through the back of best intention. Tighten the jaws to our worst vices till they leave damaging impressions. Sharpen the claws that scratch our backs till they leave open wounds that crave infection. We look for tears in eyes of laughter, indulge in fears that we expose, destroy the things we cannot master, never search for friends within our foes. We cherish things that have no meaning, embellish gods with our own rules, choosing fertile grounds to breed our young, then blame their outcome on our schools. It seems we hear but never listen, tap our feet to the wrong rhythm, practice religion and blasphemy with hypocritical precision. And because we found those guys guilty, let me do this again. And because we find them guilty, criminals languish in our prisons. Although we may not share their methods, they're still human, so we share their convictions. But despite all of nature's warnings, we refuse to take her remedies and believe we know best when we've been blind for fucking centuries. But by the time we realise that we've been fighting the wrong enemies, we'll affect our own demise and eat the dirt in our own cemeteries. I've ruined my own life through my lack of intervention, twisted my own knife in my back, best intention of tightening the jaws to my worst vices, to lay damaging impressions, sharpen the claws that scratch the backs, to open wounds that crave infections. But now I'm left here in this towering inferno to contemplate my next direction, be cremated alive or head to the window for a crash course flying lesson. And when news report of pain and grief the terrorists inflicted, they'll say innocent people died here, but I don't think they ever existed. So as a crumbling concrete curtain crashes down and crushes countless sorry lives, I take my final bow and put away my mobile phone. It's between me and my maker now.
Wow.
Sorry about me terrible slip in the middle, but I wanted to get it right. It's a difficult line, that.
It is. You said it, Mike. Nobody can do Diké like Diké, and again, he's probably written in a really intelligent way that even when people are studying me, I'm going to make them trip over my words. I'm going to make it really difficult to be me because nobody can imitate me.
And also, just to go back a point you were making, and I don't know why, but I just noticed it while we were talking about the biblical gear. We ruin our own lives with our own lack of intervention. It's very close to "Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation." Just the rhythm and the pattern and the rhymes, and it's so compact. It's such a compact poem. It's like a straitjacket. It's like he's ramming a thought, an idea into a straitjacket and holding it really tight. Each line is compact, tight, loads of information, orally beautiful to hear, complex, cadence, language falling and rising and jumping. It's when a voice becomes a musical instrument, and the way he did it, and his tones and his rhythms and stuff, it brought it to another level. I brought an element of fear to it, a real element of fear. Anyone else want to say out about the poem?
I'm going to hand over to Peter a second while I ask my niece to just stop banging the pan. She's outside my room banging the pans.
Bang the pan, niece!
So
bang the pan!
Give me a second.
I just wanted to make a comment. I know that part of our hope series that we inspire other writers to go and extend their own craft. And the one thing that I remember with Diké, when he used to come to the workshops at Identity at Commonword, was that he often had finished his poem. And if he'd finished his poem, you had no chance of affecting it whatsoever.
Never.
Never. You know what I mean? So what I learned, and this is like, how do we get the best out of people? What I learned was to seed ideas with Diké before, Shirley, when we were down, try and get the ideas in before he went home to write the poem. Because once he'd written it, and he didn't actually physically write it, he used to compose it in his head and then put it down afterwards. But what Mike was saying about the straitjacket, the very certainty of each phrase, of each beat, of each line, meant that if you propose, hey, Diké, line 3, if we could just twiddle with that. I remember once he spent, apparently, according to Shirley, he spent half an evening outside Commonword cussing me and saying that, I'm the devil for having rejected a poem that he wanted published because I wanted to edit it.
I can remember him saying, if you would, because we did this book that was called, I think it was called Hair, was something about black women's hair.
Right. Yes.
And his poem didn't get through because there was a little bit of it where there was 2 women on the panel and just one Pete. So we were like, this is misogynistic, we don't want this. And we're like, and he went, if you'd actually asked me because, you know, I was asked to write for the book, but if you'd asked me to edit it, I would have actually had a look at what it was. But we just knew from before that actually to take an edit was so hard for him to do, but he was actually, and I think that actually, you know, Pete, he would have taken the edit because it was the beginning of that change. He was putting minefields together, and he just wanted his work to be published and be out there. So there was this legacy, this thing that was left of him. And there really is only those 2 books and a few videos online that, and I mean, I have a body of his work that hasn't been published, you know, that was given to me as part of what his family gave to me when he passed away. So I have a whole folder of work that's not published. But going back to that poem, the 9/11 poem, on the day of 9/11, my mum went into hospital and I had a massive dream, and he rang me on the day to say, have you seen the news? Have you seen what's going on? These planes have flown into this building. And he went, they're saying that innocent people died there. And I've discussed this with Young Identity before, haven't I, Reese? And he was like, nobody is innocent. And I went, but there were children in the basement. There was a nursery. And he went, but nobody was innocent there. And I said, I don't understand what you mean. And he went, well, little Johnny came into the nursery this morning and saw little Anthony with a car that he wanted. And little Anthony bit little Johnny on his face, snatched the car and legged it in another corner. Who was innocent? None of them. So even the children, I mean, and that's a harshness, really, when you think about it in a poet, not to see that actually, you know, children were killed in that. But he was saying that once you were born, and I suppose it goes back to that biblical thing that we talked about before. Goes back to that
original sin, man.
Everybody bad from them barn, from them pop from they come out of their mom, they are in sin, and that's what that poem gets at. Sorry, I'll shut up again. I feel like I know him inside out, but
it's a good point. It's a good point, Shirley.
Yeah, my husband and me, Diké, had an affair. Winston was his mechanic, and I was his poetry muse.
Yeah,
well, I mean, I didn't know this part of Diké, but I can't think of anything more religious than thinking that everybody is damned from the minute they're born. That's absolutely Calvinist.
Yeah, and as a former Christian myself, I can say that's definitely Calvinism. I've done a lot of study on Calvinism.
I can hold my hand up to that one too, because I'm going away now. Sorry, I'm speaking.
Segun, you got a point, and then we'll come to Mike. I think Mike had the last point as well. We'll go to Segun first.
Yeah, just to talk about whether Diké would take editing. No. At no point, as far as I was aware, at no point in his career would he take editing to a poem that he'd written. Which I think, because I did a tour where with Apples and Snakes, where he was one of the featured poets, and basically my job as the producer of the tour was to act both as the producer and as a kind of dramaturg. Because basically what we're talking about is this was a tour where you'd have like, I think it was 5 poets, and they were encouraged to write a long form poem, basically, to write a poem where actually they would explore things. But there were 5 poets doing long form poems, and you've got to think how that fits into actually your average poetry night. And so what it really means is they can't really do more than 20 minutes each with explanations and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, Diké did something that clocked in it a little bit more. Oh, that was a battle. And I suspect in the end he just speeded it up rather than cut the line. But you know, he still did fantastic. He still performed it fantastically, and it was brilliant. You know, so afterwards, and during the tour, I'd say I had to respect his integrity. That actually he knew what he wanted as an artist, and he wasn't going to sacrifice, and he wasn't going to conform to anyone's idea of what he should be.
Very true.
Thanks for that, Segun. We're going to move on to the next section now, which is, I guess, the final reading. We've heard from all of the readers so far, apart from Pete. So over to you, Pete.
Okay, great. I will do this final poem, but I would love if we had time to hear a little bit more of it about his involvement in Speakeasy and his stage presence, and what, because I wasn't really on the inside of all that, and I still there are still mysteries to be revealed, I believe. But let me read this poem.
We've got time.
Cool. This is from Crafting the Practice, and it's called Word Up. I'll do my best. The word was on the page and dying, surrounded by professors trying to stop the sentences flatlining, but afraid to give the kiss of life. The writers tried in many ways with metaphors, similes, and cliches to animate the written page, but afraid to give the kiss of life. The word was surely faced with death, for so long page poets had held their breath when it was clear the only remedy left was to give the word the kiss of life. To understand a writer's true emotion, I feel poetry is best seen in motion. That's why words on page require promotion. On stage should be their ultimate notion. Don't get me wrong, land is a fertile choice to plant the words we choose to voice. But how can seeds of words truly propagate if they go from mind to pen and stop at paper? I've heard page poets indicate that words on stage are not as great, that on page is where they hold most weight, and performance only serves to decay their state. But we all know how most of these writers think. What bad criticism can push them off the brink. So even slam poets without worthy cause can recite their work to polite applause. If only to maintain their pride and keep their thoughts from suicide, and who knows, these faults, if given time, could mature into the finest wine. But groundbreaking text without a voice to air it, why, that's like good sex without a partner to share it. Strip the page from the word. If it's worthy, expose it. If it deserves to be heard, let it go, don't hold it. The page is foreplay. The stage is waiting. Spoken words are sowing wild oats and mating, whilst your words are home alone, masturbating. The climax on page, why, that's premature ejaculating. And as long as we can take the stage and breathe new life to words on page, the words don't die or even age, but fly higher than we could ever gauge. So when the word draws its last breath and shouts, "Is there a slam poet in the house?" I lick my lips, wet my mouth, and a smile appears upon my face. And as I stroll past non-believers' eyes, with every step my apprehension dies. Till when I take the stage, there is no trace. I raise my voice, I rest my case. Yeah. So,
Wow.
Let me confess. First of all, I commissioned this poem from him. You know, I asked him to write it. I wanted to make him to do a bit like Segun was saying. It's a long form poem kind of thing. We were doing a conference, and I was bored with the formats of conferences where people debate earnestly in prose in a panel of 4. And so we said, let's perform these things. And so I gave him the framework, and I just gave him, you know, I said the last line has to be, you know, I raise my voice unless I rest my case, because that was the line for me to continue on with my rebuttal of whatever he said. And he never showed me the poem. Never showed it me. He left me twisting in the wind all the way up to the day of the conference. But wow, he blew everyone away out of that conference, and it just showed the mettle of the man, that you could commission him, you could give him an idea, and he'd take it and run with it, and he'd devastate you with the work that he produced. So that's one of my favorite poems of Diké, because it talks about the veneration of the stage rather than the page. And although we're holding up the minefield and we're holding up crafting the practice, it's the stage too, where, and what Cheryl was saying about the oral tradition, you know, he was an upholder of that tradition, and never more so than when he was working for Speakeasy or with Speakeasy.
Yeah, and I think that's a really brave thing to do. It's a really brave thing to point fingers, isn't it? To say, you know what, you know, you have this notion that, you know, something has to be in a book and it has to be written in this particular form, but actually, you know, what good is it if those printed words are pants, basically? And likewise, if you've got words that are written in a book and they're powerful, why are you not letting them be heard? Why? What are they doing sat in a book somewhere? Why are they not being shared for an audience to be moved by it, to hear it, to be in the moment with you on that? I think there's something really profound.
Okay, I am not going to disagree with DK's poem, and I love the oral tradition, and I didn't really become myself as a poet until I joined Identity and started performing. So I started off as a page poet and didn't even like my own stuff until I switched over to being a performance poet. But I think that, just for everybody out there, maybe the reason why you don't read your poem is because you're not a good reader. Not everybody is a DK or a performer. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody has stage presence. They might not be able to read their own poems best. I had to listen to T.S. Eliot's reading of his own poems. If you've ever listened to that, that's some of the worst reading you'll ever hear. I think the poems are really good. His reading of it is terrible. And so to be gifted like DK was, or even to have people teach you how to do it like people taught me, that is luck. Some people, but I don't know, I don't see anything wrong with hiring somebody to read your stuff. You know what I mean? But again, do people have money to do that? So I just want to speak up for the people who are not performers, because sometimes it's better just to let it live on a page.
Good point. That's a good point, Cheryl. And I must say, he was operating in the cab rank system. If I'd asked him to argue the opposite, he would have done so, He takes his check and he makes his case, He wasn't too fussy like that, I think he was on the side of was it the devils or the angels? It was the devils and angels thing. It was Shamshad Khan, me, John Sadiq, and DK. And DK just wiped the floor. I remember you were on the front row. I remember your shock at the format when he pulled that one off. But yeah, it was the commissioning process that I was impressed with him by, because there was a professionalism to the way we went about it, and that idea that it kind of matched my sense that I wanted to push him. I wanted him to write about something he hadn't thought of writing about. And in that way, get him out into different zones and enlarge his idea of what poetry could do. But the nobody who knew DK on the stage could forget his moments in Speakeasy. I'll do one short anecdote on that one, which was we were doing something at Greenery Room. I'm sure it was probably a Commonword event, so maybe it was Speakeasy, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a sort of cut down Speakeasy, but it wasn't going well. It was, the audience was sort of itchy, scratchy, moving around. The bar was busy. Poets coming, poets going. No one really cared. And DK was coming back from London, and I remember meeting him just as he came through the green room doors. I said, DK, the place is dying, man. You got to do something. He said, hold my jacket, Pete. He took his jacket off and literally walked straight up through that long walkway that the green room had to the left-hand side, popped onto the stage, boom, he transformed the place, and everything just happened from that moment, That was how he was. And if we could bottle that, we'd all be rich.
Thank you for that, Pete. Shirley, you had a point, and Mike, I think you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I remember, again, I was just reiterating that I remember it was between Shamshad Khan and DK that she'd written about why it was important to have page poetry, and he had written this piece that was about, once you'd written it, it deserved to be in the book, whether or not it was, it was 4 stanzas per poem, 4 lines, the structured pieces, that we do, like, cinquain, a haiku, a sonnet, or whatever. He felt that once it had been written, it should, and this is probably why Mike was saying, I love this book, Mike. And I found it's got his signature in it as well, and he had signed it, but he really felt that actually, if you were going to perform, it should live in both places. And I think that Tupac at the point was his inspiration, You know, he was saying, you know, Tupac ultimately was a poet and a rapper. And he said to me one time, you write the lyrics of a song down, you learn the lyrics of a song, and you don't think anything of it. And you don't think it's terrible because, you know, of the structure of it. You know, it's got a chorus in it, it might have loads of repeats in it, but it's still written down and people still, you know, I remember going online and finding a song so I could learn the lyric to sing it because I love the song so much. And he was like that about spoken word. He felt like it deserved a book just as much as it deserved a stage. That's all I was going to say.
Thanks for that, Shirley. Mike had a point, and then I come to Segun. I saw Segun's hand as well.
Yeah, I was going to pick up a point that Pete was making about his professionalism, and something I've chatted to Segun about a few times. And his professionalism is because he was a pro. And with that essence of being a pro from the very start was the awareness of the fiscal importance of his professionalism and getting dough. Mine, Phil, was a product. Diké was interested in product. He was touring and doing gigs and knowing he'd knock out every book he could carry in his bag. The more product you got in your bag, the more you can knock out. Now, as far as I know, he was scratching around doing bits of this, doing bits of that. It was an important part of his thing. It was an important part of his thing to have those books so that he could knock them out. And he knew that I'd do that with him and I'd support him like that. But product was important. He was very aware of the business of the poetry game and his position within it.
I think it was something he taught all of us, actually. You know, there was brothers talk and sisters talk, and we all ended up like printing like pages of our work so that at the end of, if we didn't have a book, but at the end of a performance, we could sell a single poem. But that we learned that from Diké with the artwork and the poet together. Sorry, Segun, I jumped in before you.
No problem. I think you're quite right. Diké understood the importance of merchandise. I'm surprised he never actually made a T-shirt, you know, and a mug as well. Except that you wouldn't be able to get that many words on those. I do remember the night he used to organise. What was it called now? The Circle, Articulate. And I remember once, because one of the things I think that Diké loved was actually experimenting with different forms of presenting poetry through performance, and so. I remember we did a models one. I think Sydney Pantry did some designs and got these absolutely stunningly gorgeous models to do a catwalk with dresses, which poetry was basically written into.
Word
and
it was called. It was called
okay.
Word on Cloth.
Yeah, it was a really great event, and I just love the fact that Diké had this he had an imagination, and he always wanted to explore different ways of performance, I think. So if you want to speak easy, actually one thing, let me say two things actually. One thing is about the whole rap thing. And I don't know how many people who know Diké knew this, but basically Diké he basically put himself into rap battles, as in freestyle improvising rap battles, where he'd turn up and these would be proper battles on stage with like packed house full of hip hop fans, and you'd have these freestyle rappers and there'd be a competition, and he would put himself up there doing his poetry, no compromises. He didn't change to try and sound more like rap. He would do it in exactly the same style, but he would shift it around a bit so it involved disses. And what I loved about it was that he kind of conned them because he didn't freestyle. He just learnt his poems. He just learnt loads and loads of disses, loads of poetic disses, and he would go to these freestyles and he would wipe the floor with people, you know. It's fantastic. But the speakeasy memory I've got, I guess, is probably the classic one was when we did a Christmas show. I think it was Black Christmas, we called it. And Diké, without any warning, turned up with a new poem called Santa is a Player. All I can say is
I know that poem.
Search for it on YouTube. search for it on YouTube. You will see. Basically, he came on stage dressed in my jaw dropped when he came on stage. Basically, dressed in a Santa outfit, but basically with no trousers.
Boxer shorts. Red boxer shorts.
Red box. Oh, no, I don't think he had boxer shorts. You know,
He had a pair of weird shorts on. He had a pair of weird shorts on.
He did.
Okay,
He had.
I thought it was just a tunic.
He had a massive big red T-shirt on, belted up like with a Father Christmas belt and red boxer shorts. And I'll tell you something about that poem, and Mike wants to speak. But we used to work in a school in the Wirral, and DK did that poem at a school, and the follow, yeah, exactly. And there's a line in it where it says something about where Santa puts his present.
That's how Santa empties his sack. Is the line?
That's how Santa empties his sack. And the following, we did the school for like 3 years on the run, and then finally they had no money because it was a festival, and the kids got to vote which poets would come back, and they voted for DK to go back with the Santa poem, and it was because no compromise, no, even in the school, no compromise. Read your stuff, believe in your stuff, and believe the power of what you've written down. Because I remember that Sonia, I was on it. I think Julian Daniels, a few others, and we were like, no, don't do that poem, like this. And he was like, nope, and just went on stage, did the poem, and the following year the school brought him back.
Shirley, Shirley, can I ask a question? I'm jumping back to what Segun mentioned before about DK's participation in rap battles. Your face had a reaction. I think you went to one of those events with DK. Am I right?
The reason why Segun brought it up, because Segun was in the car too. So no, I'm not sure if he came. It was me, Peter. No.
Yeah, I was there.
You were there, and
in Leeds.
I did a poem. I'm like trying to be like DK, and I'm going 2 words. It's worth praying for. 2 words. It's worth dying for. And this guy comes on and goes, yo, you fat hoe, get off the stage, don't you know? And oh my God, and I was there trying to be all serene and talking about my poetry like this. And honest to God, they mashed me up. Winston disowned me. DK disowned me. Because again, with that same poetry organization, a little bit like Peter, when you made him a host because he just kept winning everything, that organization never put him in with another poet. They used to just bring him on as a special guest. So he'd be in this, he'd go on into the boxing ring and then do a poem and be paid as a special guest rather than slamming against it.
Mike?
I don't know if it's time to finish, but I've got to go. Yeah.
We've got like literally 2 or 3 more minutes left. We're going to go to Mike, and then we're going to wrap up.
Just dead quick, I hate the lionisation of people, and we've got to talk briefly about when DK got it wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
He got it wrong.
When? Tell me.
He got it wrong on a number of occasions. He misjudged things. I think Father Christmas was wrong. I think his Father Christmas poem was wrong.
I think it could have been edited.
I think it was extremely naughty. But I don't know if I think it was wrong, because I think it's right that you want to write.
Okay, let me rephrase it. Let me rephrase it then. DK was a player. He used his spoken word to play. But sometimes, and it was mentioned earlier, he misjudged. One time I was in Liverpool doing a slam with Segun. Me, DK, whoever it was. Segun was a host. And DK got all sexy when you just knew it wasn't appropriate. He was in Liverpool, man. Working class women there, and he was getting all... And he was just out first round. They weren't having it. Sometimes you got it wrong, DK.
I think that's very important. I think it's very important, Mike, that DK and all poets should dare to get things wrong. You know, in that it's very important to allow yourself to fail. And perhaps the most painful, I'm not sure, I'm not on the stage that much, but perhaps the most painful thing for a poet to do is to get things wrong in front of an audience of hundreds. But I'm sure it's also a crucible, and that you then learn how to get it right. But it comes back to a point, which is that you can be very popular as a poet, but you might then be tapping into an element of populism that might be atavistic, and that might be something we need to leave behind rather than take forward in life.
Bernard Manning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So with DK's process, I think that was why it's very, very important. He came to our workshops, I don't know how long for, Shirley, but it's about 10 years. He even had his own seat at the table. Yeah, and if you couldn't sit in that seat, that was DK's seat, you know. And he said, this is like church to me, Pete, you know. And I think that dialogue, which he had with you as well, Mike, the dialogue about how should I go about creating poetry? What is my craft? What are my themes? What is this poem doing, or what could it do? That was his feedback mechanism. And sometimes he did get that feedback. I want to go out by asking about how whether when he was singing, that contributed to his knowledge of how to perform, you know, to use his voice in poetry. But if to just join you, Mike, briefly in an area where he kind of went wrong was I paid him to host something, but only 5 people turned up, and so he was annoyed, and so he hosted in a really desultory way, and my publisher from the Express, Dr. Nadebayo, was in the audience and got so annoyed with DK that he got up out of the audience, took the mic off him, and said, "I'll host it." And I'll tell you what, Dotton went for it. He started doing all kinds of dance moves about when he used to be a mod and God knows what, you know. And he cooked the audience in a way that DK refused. And from that, I learned that DK could host, but he didn't like to particularly. He wasn't, to coming back to something you said, you know, he was professional as a poet, but he really didn't like being shoehorned into being a host. And I only made him a host of the Poetry Slam because when he was a poet, he won the damn thing every time, and there was no hope for anyone else. So I had to farm him off into the hosting. But I take your point that there can be times when he might be off, and that was our job as friends and as fellow poets to get him back on track, if you like, or if there is such a thing as a track. But I realise I've been talking a while and I've not got Reese up on screen. But I am curious, before everyone leaves, I'm not sure he's got to go, to know, because I heard him sing on YouTube. He's singing in one speakeasy. And I was like, hey, wait a minute. Where's the crossover between that and poetry, the performance of poetry?
I think it was the musicians, wasn't it, Segun, that challenged the poets to see whether or not they could sing to these pieces, and he came.
Well, no, I think it was basically the idea was that we would do a speakeasy where everybody would be singing, including all the poets and I think it was all inspired by divas. I think that was the idea.
Yeah, I remember, and he did. And I tell you what, he was at his sickest. And that's one of the things that I remember. He could hardly breathe, and he did Dock of the Bay, and he did Dock of the Bay and Prince, and it was one of the times where because that's when he started to lose the weight, and you could see the muscle going, and you could, when he sat, his chest was doing something like this, you know, where it was fluttering. But he belted that song out, and he was so professional. And I can remember people dropping out of that particular speakeasy very last minute, because you had to stand in and do choruses for people that had rehearsed with other members of the speakeasy. But he was like, and I can remember him being really mad again, like Peter said, you know, when he took umbrage, he took it, you know, here is he, hardly got breath to sing, and people are going to drop out because they didn't feel like doing it that night. Do you know what I mean? Because he took speakeasy serious, and I think at that point he started to run it as well. It shifted over to him because we took it in turns to run it, and it shifted over to him. So he took umbrage that people didn't take it serious, and he had taken it serious when he could hardly breathe.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing, I guess, in terms of and I guess that's one of the impressive things I think about those last couple of years of his life is that as he was getting sicker, he was actually taking on the responsibility of running a regular poetry event, and not just taking on, but he was pushing it ahead. You know, he was pushing it forwards, and when he died, the impetus dropped out of it quite a lot. You know, because he'd taken on the role so forcefully. So I think, as Mike says, he was not a perfect man, and you know, I fully expected at his funeral to see women breaking out in cat fights, basically, all the different girlfriends of his life, you know. But and you know, he was his own. In some ways, his virtue, his integrity was actually could be a stumbling block for him, you know. But I think that's the case for everybody. Is that your greatest virtue, your greatest skill, your greatest attribute can often be the thing that holds you back. And his stubbornness and his determination, I think he could have probably got booked in even more places than he was getting booking if he'd have accepted editing himself and changing himself to fit in with other people's, which is what other poets do, you know. So his greatest attribute was actually sometimes his greatest weakness, and that's the essence of for me, that's the essence of a tragic hero. Not to get deep on it, but the flaw is what makes you great and what makes you weak.
Thanks for that, Segun. I'm going to move to Cheryl for the last point, and then what I'd like us to do, and you can think about this before Cheryl speaks, if all of us can think about one thing that makes a Diké poem a Diké poem. So if we're going to, you know, look at the DNA of a Diké poem, what one or two things could anybody be inspired by, wants to write, wants to be challenged to work in the way that Diké works? Let's have a little think about it and try and finish the conversation with some of those hallmarks of Diké's work. But Cheryl, sorry.
I was going to not say what I was going to say because what Segun just said would seem like a good endpoint. A long time ago, Pete, you were asking about what difference does it make singing if you're a poet? And since I've always been a singer and a poet, I will confess this is really frivolous after everything we've been saying, but I started singing during readings because everybody remembers you if you sing. And the singing actually calms me down because you have to take those long breaths and things. So it's a lot auto-hypnosis at the beginning of a reading. It calms me down. Our audiences love it and they always remember you. So if you've been, you know, like 1 of 10, then they're gonna remember the one that sang, aren't they? So and I always tell writers that because a lot of people can sing and that's an easy way to get remembered. So that's frivolous. What makes a Diké poem a Diké poem? I think for me, it is that, I was just talking about auto-hypnosis, but it is that flow that hypnotizes the audience and brings them in. And it's also when you read them, as opposed to hear them, that they're very, very serious, most of them. They're the ones that I've been reading anyway, have been about very serious things, and that they were written by someone who I didn't realize he knew when he was a teenager, but that was always there for him. And it's in the poems and sort of hidden in plain sight. And now we can actually feel the weight of it, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Yep, Shirley, do you want to share your takeaway, your hallmark of a Diké poem?
It's the rhythm. So before language was ever created, before the first word was pronounced, before the first pupils dilated, emotions arrived unannounced. It's the rhythm and the cadence, and even the way that he wrote before. He wrote it as B, and then the number 4. So just even the way that he wrote his pieces, you know, using numerical symbols within the pieces, but the rhythm and the cadence and the message.
Great, thank you. Mike?
the sense of authority with which his words carried. You believed him. And secondly, I think he was coming from a place and telling us things that we didn't have the capacity to know. And that's where the authority comes from. And obviously the voice.
So I guess with that, it's about writing from your truth, yeah? Writing from your truth and owning that truth, and yeah, putting it across in a way that even if others who haven't lived your experience or lived your life can see in the first instance, it's like you say, having that conviction to put it across and let your words do the work. Cool, thanks for that, Mike. Segun?
Well, I think a lot's been said about the word, the poetry in itself, so I don't add any more about that apart from his skill with images and creating images that just really stuck in your mind, that played on images that were in common currency and twisted them in a slightly different way. I think in terms of his performance, what I think his relationship with the audience basically is that he would have a very, because his style was very quiet and he wasn't what I'd call a grandstanding performance poet. He would talk very quietly and very deliberately and without that much movement around, and so he drew the audience into his circle, his small circle. And that was, I think that was his great power as a performer.
Thank you, Segun. And last but certainly not least, Pete.
The word that came to me straight from my intuition, I've got no explanation for it, is grace. And I think he had a transcendental grace that meant that he brought us to an understanding of the world and our place in the world that was beyond our particular circumstances every time, both in the words and in the public presence on stage. And actually, for those of us who knew him, his presence when he was among us, when he was with us, there was a grace there, a transcendental grace. And for me, I've never met it before, and I've not met it since, in truth.
Thank you for that, Pete. I'm going to round up the conversation there. I'm firstly going to thank you all for being here, for giving up your time. Thank you, Segun, Pete, Cheryl, Mike, and Shirley. For me, it's been a really rich conversation, and I hope that those who are watching this video agree. What we are going to do is all of the poems that we have heard in this reading, we are going to make them available for you to have a look at in your own time, to digest, to find meaning, and to hopefully find some inspiration. And likewise, you can look out for some of the worksheets that Cheryl Martin's going to be producing that kind of respond to the work of Diké. Thanks again for tuning in. You've been watching The Hook, which focuses on the work of the late, great Diké Omeje, brought to you by Manchester City of Literature and Commonword. Thank you so much for tuning in.